for those who had worked in the native country and paid payroll taxes on their Italian wages. On the other hand, the rejection of the attempts at postponing the earliest age at which retirement benefits were payable. It was hardly by a chance that at a debate in New York City before the 2018 vote, when a candidate was asked why the discussion had focused on the specific interests of Italians living in the US and Italy's politics had been neglected, the candidate retorted that, quote, there are 600 members of the parliament who will take care of such matters. Likewise, during the same campaign, the candidate suggested that all the elected members of parliament should establish a caucus that would represent the foreign constituency beyond partisan divisions, echoing a similar stance while congratulating the 3 winners of seats in parliament from North America. A reader of America Oggi made a point of reminding that, quote, the mandate is only to promote the agenda of Italian nationals in the world, regardless of their own political affiliation, and that there were other deputies and senators in their respective parties, those elected in Italy, to, quote, enact the platforms of the tickets on which they ran, unquote. Even when candidates and voters addressed matters that seemed relevant to Italian politics only, they were actually concerned about the repercussions of such issues in the United States. For instance, between 2006 and 2013, worries about Berlusconi's conflict of interests as a media mogul and entrepreneur governing Italy, as well as about his efforts to secure immunity from prosecution for violation of the fiscal codes and other laws, hardly involved a stand against corruption and the endorsement of reform programs per se. Rather, critics of Berlusconi in the US feared that his actions would damage the reputation of Italians in the United States, interfering with their own business activities and with the standing of their own ethnic minority in American society. A 2020 survey revealed that, in the view of Italians abroad, the assessment of the performances of their homeland's government was strictly connected to the perception of Italian migrants in the adoptive society. Specifically, 63% thought that greater government efficiency in Italy contributed to improving much the image of Italians abroad, and another 26% believed that it contributed, quote, enough. After all, in order to promote an image of political efficiency for Italy, whose fallout was supposed to benefit Italian citizens in the US too, Italian American voters were willing to give up a part of their delegation to the Italian parliament. A constitutional referendum was held in 2020 to the effect of approving or rejecting a reduction in the number of seats in the Italian Chamber and Senate. The official reason for the reform was to save money on the wages of the members of parliament and to make the legislative process more effective. Specifically, the changes involved cutting the number of deputies elected in the foreign constituency from 12 to 8, and that of senators from 8 to 4. All the 3 members of parliament elected in the US came out against this reorganization on the ground that it would stifle the already feeble political voice of Italians in the US. Yet, voters in the US disregarded their representatives' stand and endorsed the decrease in the number of members of parliament by an 80% majority. In conclusion, the political universe of most Italian citizens in the US has been unable to extend beyond the boundaries of the adoptive society and has not shown significant interest in the ancestral or native country. On the one hand, many current newcomers from Italy are brain-drained immigrants with a cosmopolitan self-perception. They think of themselves less as Italian nationals abroad than as citizens of the world, or reveal such hostility toward the mother country on the ground that Italy at least indirectly forced them to move abroad to improve their professional lives or to achieve a better education, that they feel no stimuli to have a say in the native land's politics. On the other hand, the US-born progeny of the immigrants reveals primarily a symbolic Italian identity confined to leisure time activities such as vacationing in their ancestral country, wearing Italian-style clothes, or eating Italian food. Those who are more likely to cast ballots in Italy's elections are the descendants of immigrants who reclaimed their ancestral citizenship. Thank you. Yet, as few as 17,000 seized this opportunity between 1998 and 2007, before the procedure became much more complex. There were definitely a small minority of the about 15 million US residents who referred to themselves as Italian Americans while taking the census in the year 2000. Overall, therefore, external voting rights have failed to create a political landscape that encourages people of Italian background in the US to cultivate an identity based on their ancestral roots. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Stefano. Our second speaker is Donna Chirico.
Thank you. Good morning. Buongiorno. I want to acknowledge not only the organizers of the conference, but I really want to say a special thank you to Lara and all of the many people who have made the conference run so smoothly. Thank you. Yeah. They have been invisible, which is a wonderful thing, and yet everything works delightfully. So thank you. I'm speaking today about physical borders and psychological borders. The second industrial revolution generated unparalleled movement of people and ideas. Rail and maritime transportation provided opportunities in distant places and the ability to travel to those places. It was during this era that psychology emerged as an independent discipline in 1876, and by necessity began to explore a rapidly changing social milieu and how it influences individual mental states. A pioneer in understanding the sense of disconnection this causes within the individual was Emil Durkheim, whose concept of anomie remains relevant today in explaining the loss of meaning individuals experience when the societal norms and personal values they hold dear are no longer valid. In psychology, the focus is on how the disconnect from the social structure affects the development of identity and mental health. Migration in the Italian diaspora continues to have profound influence on identity development, individuation, and identificational assimilation. The individual is moving towards self-actualization while trying to mold identity to the culture of migration, and in turn is being shaped by that culture. This often involves modifying or even abandoning cherished values. It certainly includes adjusting to a different set of norms, which may or may not be antithetical to the culture of origin. The individual must absorb the values of the privileged host culture in the creation of identity. This integration of culture into personal identity happens in psychological development for everyone, regardless of migration status. But when an individual migrates, this process is complicated. It is often exigent and can be problematic. The concept of borderline personality was introduced by Adolf Stern in 1938 and popularized in the 1970s by Otto Kernberg, a psychoanalyst who developed a treatment methodology. The current understanding of borderline personality shares symptomology with anomie. Both assume that the individual is in a state of psychic stress, where there is a sense of instability, fear of being disregarded, and problems with self-image. The disjunction between the adopted culture and its values vis-a-vis those in minoritized communities within the Italian diaspora needs to be better understood in this context. How is the psychological self affected within a transnational context? And how does the crossing of physical borders lead to a borderline mental state? The theoretical foundations of this exploration should be informed by the work of Erik Erikson and Lev Vygotsky, who both maintain that the development of more complex psychological functioning is dependent on social context. Vygotsky additionally stresses the importance of language in development. Hence, identity formation and mental well-being for the migrant relies upon social adaptation to avoid a mental state that is borderline or borderless, and language plays a key role in this. After Freud, various theories began to emerge where the ego was seen in relation to other variables that influence the development of the self. Further, like Freud, most of these models use sequences of stages to indicate development. It quickly became evident that during different times in one's life, different issues are important to the self. As an infant, it's nurturance. As you get older, it's generativity. However, broader societal influences from the beginning of life go beyond the family. This is especially salient in the later part of the 20th century to the present, where childcare outside the home became prevalent as more women entered and stayed in the workforce, as extended families also became less common. Last year, the New York Times ran a special story about the unwillingness of grandparents in China to be babysitters. The phenomenon has become so widespread that these grand nannies are influencers now on social media. Thus, there is an increasing reliance on people outside the child's immediate family and who bring their values into the sphere of the child, which in turn influences early childhood development. Just read Winston Churchill's poignant descriptions of his nanny, Elizabeth Everett, and his distant mother. Anyone who has taken intro psychology has heard of Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, first proposed in the 1950s and then later modified as new research emerged. And by the way, it was initially called, of course, the 8 stages of man. He sought that rather than development being finished by the time one is 6 or 7 years old, that it continues into and throughout the lifespan, for better or worse. You can reach a stage positively, and then later, because of some societal impact, you can reverse in that stage. Lev Vygotsky's theory has been overshadowed by both Erikson and his contemporary Jean Piaget, whose stage model of cognitive development became what is taught mostly in psychology courses. Yet Vygotsky gave us a theory that highlights how social interaction influences the development of cognition and consequently of the self. This is happening 20 years before Erikson. Vygotsky is important because of his insistence that language is the key element in development and that social learning must come before cognitive development can proceed. Piaget, on the other hand, believed that learning follows development. Vygotsky stated, learning is a necessary and universal aspect of the process of developing culturally organized, specifically human psychological function. Vygotsky is critical in understanding how migration between or among cultures and shifting languages will lead to psychological outcomes in the development of the self. Vygotsky was neglected in psychology for many years for two reasons. Unlike Piaget and Erikson, who both had very long lives, Vygotsky died at the age of 37. Another factor was that Vygotsky was not in the mainstream of either European or American psychology. He was a Russian and he was a Jew. Reflecting upon his own work at the end of his life, Vygotsky wrote in his notebooks about his theory, "This is the final thing I have done in psychology, and I will, like Moses, die at the summit, having glimpsed the promised land, but without setting foot on it. Farewell, dear creatures, the rest is silence." It is evident that post-Erikson, Piaget, and Vygotsky, the discipline of psychology has come to understand the significance of social influences, including language upon development. A concern has been what leads to positive psychological development. The tendency has been to focus on the abnormal or what goes wrong rather than what creates a positive outcome. In 2012, the American Psychological Association published the results of a presidential task force on immigration entitled Crossroads, The Psychology of Immigration in the New Century. The report clearly denotes that there is a different outcome and different concerns as you progress through the lifespan. A critical outcome of the investigation, central to the arguments here, is the relationship of xenophobia and discrimination to the social context of reception. This means that the misunderstanding or mistreatment of immigrants at arrival is significant in unfolding of psychological development as the person remains in the host country. That initial experience will have different outcomes depending on when the person arrives with regard to their age and development. It is obviously different for a child coming to a different country than someone who's older and may have a more developed sense of ego and sense of self. So just a little bit about the Italian diaspora relating to this. We know what diaspora means, but some things that have changed are the way people migrate. In the past, oftentimes it was very linear. People went from one place to a second place and they stayed there. Today, we see that people will often move from one place to a second place to a third place, sometimes a fourth place. And of course, each time, a potentially different language, different culture. I always say, just imagine moving from Staten Island to Iowa. So another concern is the continued movement when people are children, right? So if you're moving children from place to place during development, this can have a dramatic impact. So I wanted to mention a particular theory that is really just emerging in psychology called the triple package theory. The success of the Italian diaspora must be considered as this maintains an association with things Italian and contributes to maintaining an Italian or hyphenated Italian identity as part of overall identity. Amy Chua and Jed Rubenfield have put forward a model that, while it's not without flaws in its methodology, provides a dynamic perspective. Their book, The Triple Package Theory, How Three Unlikely Traits Explain the Rise and Fall of Cultural Groups in America, explores the variables for success related to the reasons just stated about the need for connectiveness and moving away from disconnection. Their research, looking at those immigrants who have achieved the highest rates of success, argues that there are three traits necessary. One, you must have a superiority complex, an internalized sense that your group is special or exceptional. Two, you have to be insecure, which can be thought of as a fear or pronounced anxiety. And lastly, you have to have impulse control, which they define as the ability to resist temptation, especially the temptation to give up in the face of hardship or quit instead of persevering at a task. It is evident that these three traits can be seen in the experience of the Italian diaspora. Superiority complex. All things Italian are better. Exactly, who's better? The Made in Italy movement has helped to reinforce this. No one mentions that the Japanese bought Peroni or that the French conglomerate Nestle owns Perugina. There is an appeal of Italian-sounding brands. Think of it that in the United States, Sara Lee sells a loaf of white bread that is called artisano. This superiority complex can be seen in its broad cultural expression and at the micro level in the Italian family. No one makes sauce better than my Nonna is heard after Nonna is dead, and no one really remembers what the sauce tasted like in the first place. It will be interesting to see how Nonna's absence as a caregiver will influence this perspective moving into the future. Fear and anxiety persist for both old and new Italian immigrants, in part because immigration means taking risks. Anxieties arise for many reasons because moving to a new country brings unknowns, including language, customs, or even using the standard measurement system versus the metric system. More established immigrants still bear the anxiety of not fitting into mainstream white American society. The anxieties felt will influence the development of the self and self-perception. If language and culture are barriers, then the disconnections associated with anomie or the borderline personality may dominate. The last aspect of impulse control at first seems counter to the stereotype of loud Italians and Italian families, or the laissez-faire attitude Italians often project. There is, though, much evidence to suggest that Italian immigrants persist in the category of economic gains while maintaining a code of silence about the efforts or struggles involved in this. There is research that addresses the fact that Italian Americans are less likely to seek psychological help outside the immediate family. This has been an issue in the mental health community and in educational settings for decades. It is easy to understand why Italian immigrants maintain their Italian identity. They live in a transnational environment where the assertion of ethnic identity, maintaining one's language and traditions, are now acceptable. It is harder to understand the aversion to the newfound emigres in identifying with the country they have chosen. For Italian Americans who are 4 or 5 generations removed from the original immigrant experience, the difficulty is in understanding the attachment to Italy and things Italian. This is seen in the ever-rising numbers of people identifying as Italian American, as Stefano just mentioned, and the rise of organizations and media networks. If one applies the principles of the triple package theories, the incongruities become less so. These assertions of pride come from the sense of being special and the need to preserve heritage, but it is also connected to the protection of the developing self in a radically changed environment. The American Psychological Association continues to devote much effort towards understanding the immigrant experience and refugee experience better, and continuing to do research into how does one preserve the psychological well-being and establishing a sense of self for these individuals. And just a quote from the report I just mentioned, positive outcomes require stakeholders within clinical practice, research, education, and public policy sectors to become culturally competent as cognizant of an array of diverse interacting factors: immigrant generation, gender, race, age, sexual orientation, religion, social class, education. English language proficiency and disability that may influence an immigrant's mental health and adjustment. The psychological community has yet to fully address these needs, but they are a critical concern, and they are what we need to do moving into the future as the immigrant community continues to change. Thank you.
Thank you. And Fred Gardaphé.
I too would like to thank everybody who had a little part or a big part of making this a fantastically successful conference. Laura especially. No, you have made this almost, the problems you encountered are invisible to us. And that is the quality, I think, of a master organizer. My talk today is based on my life. It's called Torno a Castellana, Roots Realism versus Trendy Roots Tourism. In 1978, I was 25 years old and the first of my family to return to the birthplace of my mother's parents. Since then, I have fostered relationships with my extended family and with the town of my nonny's birth that have changed lives on both sides of the Atlantic. This occurred long before the idea of roots tourism became popular and trendy. My talk today concerns my experience with what I call roots realism, which I believe lies at the foundation of what is today is called roots tourism. Roots realism combines the lived experience with the learned experience to create a theory for understanding what today is being called roots return tourism, and providing a substantial human foundation for this experience that transcends the commercial goals and lures suggested by this marketing strategy. And I want to do a shout out today to almost every panel I attended at this conference, because what I'm about to talk about are some of the pitfalls of a white paper that was created that helped to create ITALIANA and roots tourism. And I'm going to critique it a little bit, but I'm also, I think, in favor of expanding its ideas. And that's, my talk is going to do that. I examined the psychological and philosophical bases for better and more humanly presenting the value of roots return tourism. And the shout out to the other panels was especially this panel yesterday on immigrant women in Canada, because the idea was preserving the stories. That to me is the anima. All the Canadians are flying. To me, that's the anima of roots tourism. How many people are familiar with the series White Lotus? Okay, if you are, if not, to me, this white paper will lead to the experience of returning to your roots in White Lotus, which to me is one of the most fantastic failures of roots tourism in the history of the world. They go back, they try to convince these people they're related, and the people say, get out of here, they chase them out. And they have no repercussions about that. This to me represents, I mean, as strange as that may be, this to me represents what we, you know, the problem of approaching roots return with roots tourism. So I speak for the idea of roots truism. I am a truist. I'm not a tourist. And the story that I will share with you today, which is the basis of a book that I've been working on for a long time, and I hopefully will finish this year, is called A Generation Removed. And I want to thank Maddalena Tirabassi and Altre Italie for publishing the first few chapters in Italian. I have this problem where a lot of my creative work gets published in Italian before it gets published in English. I don't know what that's all about, but thank you to Maddalena for doing that. And if you're interested in the whole story of what I'm going to read a little bit from today, you can go to the most recent issue. Is it called Roots Tourism? Okay. Of Turisti per caso, even better. I knew you would. So, based on the white paper, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this white paper. It was created by the Ambrosetti European House with the support of the National Italian American Foundation. It was just distributed a few months ago in Washington, D.C. And it's, you know, it's very nice. It's got all the graphs and everything, and, you know, the finances and all that, but there's nothing in here about funding the women's projects in Canada. There's nothing here about funding any of the kind of projects that we're doing in the United States, funding the programs in which we are trying to educate people about the Italian diaspora. Because the reason why the people in that film, the series of White Lotus, failed was because they had no understanding of the value of their culture in their home in the United States. You know, roots tourism doesn't come with it's not going to be successful with a big campaign, a big ad campaign. Go visit your roots. We have denied our roots for so long, especially in the United States. I just returned from Australia a few days ago, and I saw similar stories. It takes a lot more to become an Australian and an American than it does to become an Argentinian, for example, for an Italian tourist. And this is the reason why Paolo Baracchi and I started this whole series of conferences to get together to begin sharing the stories. Because when you grow up with your own story, you begin applying your own story to everything outside the world. And you know, that's a very bad way of looking at the world. So, if I was going to subtitle this talk, it would be Where Roots Tourism Misses the Boat. They talk about leveraging emotional connection. They talk about streamlining the citizen process. I've been involved in trying to become an Italian citizen for 4 years. I have all my documents in order. They keep getting rejected here and there and so on. A focus on family interactions. There's nothing really that evolves in which people begin to talk about what is your relationship with your family in Italy? For mine, it was Christmas card contact for a long time. Studying the success or failure of maintaining connections. They need to do that. They talk about creating large-scale themed events. Most recently, an anthology of women's writing was recognized by the Italian government, which is fantastic. And so they're beginning to do some of those. They're talking about getting involved in music, food, story, art, etc. They have a long way to go. And so I say that we need to look at the difference between the tourist and the truist. And the role of, and the way we do this is looking at the role of story in roots tourism, because we need to be looking for meaning more importantly than money out of these experiences. And what it requires is a dismantling of the demeaning of migrant culture, not to the Medigans, not to the people outside, but to the people inside the culture. If they want Italian migrants and 2 or 3 generations later to come back to Italy, they have to give them some sense of what the value of Italy is to them beyond the products that Donna was talking about. So, story is the soul of roots truism. What is it that makes literature valuable to all of us? A word that I coined with some help from some indigenous scholars in Canada is the word indigenuity, which is the ability to produce knowledge that helps sustain a society beyond their migration. This comes from the idea that the knowledge that indigenous people have is good knowledge to have. When I was taught by my grandfather, and there's a chapter in this book where I talk about it, how to live in a garden, how to take care of a garden. He was teaching me how to be a custodian of the land. You know, and I didn't learn that from Native American culture. I learned it from him. But when I started seeing and studying Native American culture, I began to connect. So if you can connect to the indigenous aspects of your culture, not just the kind of surface parts, you know, the surface commodification of your culture, then you will be able to see the value of indigenuity. And that's, to me, what makes Italian American literature, Italian Argentinian literature, Italian Australian literature valuable, is when that knowledge is able to be passed down from one generation to the next. And so I'm going to leave you today with a few pages of this story from my book called The Generation Removed, which I hope will be done by the summer. And here it is. Nonno never did fit into what I believed was American. I grew up thinking that he was just one of those interesting characters of the past who was out of place in the world of astronauts and television. Nonno was an immigrant who had never really arrived, one who carried the burlap sack of his past wherever he went, a weight that slowed him down in the fast-moving modern America. He seemed to have his own world that had more to do with Italy than America. Whatever Italy was to me in my youth came from him. He reflected a dual image of that heritage, one of pride and one which embarrassed me. These two images constantly fought one another. There were times when I could only see him as the immigrant. Then Italy remained strange and foreign. But when I was close to him, I was close to those in Italy and could see the man behind the immigrant and the family he had left behind. I was always embarrassed by his mixture of Italian and English. His broken English upset me, especially when he would speak like this to me while I was with my non-Italian friends, the ones he'd call Marigans. His Italian, that strange tongue he would use when spurred to a highly emotional point in an argument, or while reminiscing with old friends, or when he didn't want us to understand what he was saying, always enchanted me. His language was only one way in which he so conflicted with the American I was growing up. I remember coming down from my bedroom one morning for breakfast, seeing him hunched over a ceramic bowl filled with hunks of stale bread, the kind that Mrs. Rossi used to throw out to the birds in her backyard. I watched in disbelief as he poured hot coffee over the bread and then added scalded milk and sugar to the mixture. Then he'd eat it. While he was eating, I gathered the courage to spill some cornflakes into my blue plastic Tupperware bowl and eat the American breakfast I had known from television. He offered me a taste of his concoction, which I rudely refused to his amusement. When I looked into his smile, I lost the image I had of him earlier when I first saw him pour the coffee over the old bread. In that closeness I loved, but still did not understand the immigrant. Nonno never used the products I thought were essential to American life. He bragged that he had never used shampoo or toothpaste and yet managed to keep a full head of beautiful hair and a mouth free of fillings. I was amazed since by the age of 10, I had already been noticing dandruff and had visited the dentist more than he ever would his entire life. He preferred to grow his own vegetables while I'd be fascinated by the ease of picking unblemished, even-sized tomatoes and other produce neatly wrapped in plastic off supermarket shelves, and frustrated by the many hours I would spend with him in his garden, sweating to produce a few oddly shaped tomatoes and peppers, and following him through fields of forest preserve picking dandelion greens, and poking puffballs down from trees. My nonna was the center of attention during the preparation of our Sunday meals. She ruled the kitchen and hollered out orders to women in our family. But my attention always turned to nonno while we ate. He fascinated me using bread and fingers to gather sauce that slid off the spaghetti, tonguing neck bones until they were meatless and dry. He could make me forget I had food in front of me. He was a noisy eater, but the sounds he made were hardly noticeable amid the loud talk at our table. He rationed the salad of bitter dandelion greens by dancing around the table with one arm hugging the bowl and the other shoveling forkfuls of greens. When he was done, he would return to his seat, hug the wooden bowl with one arm, and shove those greens into his own mouth. When the storm of the meal had blown over, he would sit back and smoke an unfiltered cigarette right at the table, often with the lit end in his mouth, teasing us. Magic, we would think. Now, he never learned to read or write, and I would feel so important when I would have to read something for him. I was the American he could never be. I was proof that his hopes of making it in America had been fulfilled. Nonno never told me why he had left Italy and never talked of his child. And whenever I asked Nonna about it, all she said was, miseria, I don't want to talk about it. So I thought miseria was a place in Italy. I guess he thought it was enough to be in America, and all that had come before no longer made any difference in his new home. After he died, no one seemed to care much about getting together for those Sunday dinners. With him were buried many of the Italian traditions our family had followed at his lead. Without his influence, Italians quickly became strangers in a collage of media images, spicy meatball eaters, Godfather gangsters, and opera buffoons. But he did leave me with a curiosity of what the old country was like. One day, the year before he died, he and I were on the beach in Southern California. Our family had traveled to my Uncle Pat's home after my father's funeral. Nonno sat on the sand, staring into the sun's reflections off the waves. He said, "This beach, she like a monopoly," which was a coastal town near Castellana Grotte in southeastern Italy where he was born. One day I'm going to go back to Castellana, Federico. He said nothing else the rest of the day. He was silent for hours, as though he was in a trance. It was a look I had never seen before, and it frightened me. I playfully covered him with sand, and he sat there until the tide washed it away. His body was burned quite badly, but it didn't seem to bother him. In some way, he had been in Italy during those hours. It had been more than 50 years since he had seen the land he had come from. And whenever I pictured him after he died, it was with that expression he had on his face that day at the beach in California. As I turned my energies toward pursuing an education and pleasures of being a teenager in America, the memories of Nonno were buried. I often lost my family and my growing disenchantment with the American way. In the late 70s, I decided to get as far away from my family as possible. I planned a trip to Europe to visit friends in Denmark and Sweden. And as I gathered addresses, I thought it might be interesting to visit Italy for a few days, if I had the time. Nonna had maintained only Christmas card contact with the other family in Castellana. She had the address of Nonno's brother, and I wrote to him. But by the time I left, I had not received a response and wondered if I should bother to stop in Castellana at all. My trip began in Northern Europe, and it seemed the closer I came to Italy, the more emotional I was becoming. On the train from Venice to Bari, I began to feel confused. I asked myself over and over, what if my family doesn't recognize me? They have no pictures. What if they can't understand me? I've only studied Italian for 3 months, and Venice had proven that I could understand but not speak it well. But even as I worried, the excitement grew. From Bari to Castellana Grotte, I stood in the train, looking out the window, staring at the vineyards and the olive groves. The scenery brought a tarantella to mind, one that Nonno used to sing. He taught it to me while he was working in the garden. I thought of the words and translated them as best I could remember. In Italy, man and nature live together. The young grapes shaded by the old vines, protected by the hot and windy weather, until they ripen into vintage wines. In Italy, man and nature live as one. The old olive tree always bears new fruit, though whipped by the wind and burned by the sun, man and nature like a heel to a boot. Now those words had pictures that maybe mean something to me. Now I understood what he was talking about when he would sit for hours in his garden talking to the plants, telling me about each one, giving them names and stories to go along with them. I couldn't keep from crying as I believed that in some way I was carrying Nonno back to Castellana. As the first of the American family to return, I was welcomed with tears, kisses, and strong embraces, and a little bit of suspicion, because they thought that I was there to claim the land that belonged to my Nonno. That's another story. After only a few days, I felt as though I belonged in Castellana. I was able to live as Nonno did. I even worked 10 hours a day picking beans in the same field that he had worked in when he was young. And when I couldn't straighten my back out after picking the fava, I better understood why he left Italy. I was able to speak to his brother and sister and for the first time know what his life in Italy had been like. I learned that he, like so many other Southern Italians, had left home to find work in America. The plan was for him to make enough money for the family to buy the land they worked on until they owned it. He would send money back to Castellana and promise each in a letter that one day he would return. That one day never came, for soon he had a family of his own to support. Learning all this helped me to regain a part of me that was lost when he died. I was whole, proud, now more than ever, of my Italian heritage. My pride no longer stemmed from ignorance. It was a pride of wisdom and of love and of the sacrifices he had made for me to give me life. Each day in Castellana began with a breakfast of hard bread in a ceramic bowl over which I poured coffee, scalded milk, and sugar. I had to laugh at myself as I recalled that morning so many years earlier when I saw him eating the same. I visited the house where he was born and spent long times inside that stone cottage, touching what he had once touched, seeing what at one time I knew he had seen. I was so lost in emotion I cried without even trying to hide my tears. I felt this place had some kind of power over me. When I left his home, I felt for the first time that I had a history that I had never studied in school, a history that would have remained lost had I never traveled back to Castellana. I spent my last day in Italy on the beach in Monopoli. Alone, I sat on the beach staring into the sun's reflection off the rolling waters. I realized that I was seeing what he had been staring at that day years ago in California. And I thought, someday I will come back to Castellana. Little did I know then that a few years later I would be married at Castellana, and many years later I would own property in Castellana. Thank you.
It's always a challenge to follow Fred. I'm going to present part of what I prepared, so there's time for questions. And I just want to talk a little bit about history and about, and then offer a couple of sort of sad anecdotes that we experience in the United States. So one of the first things we scholars do when we engage in public discussions is to define our terminology. We do so for two reasons. First, words come with a series of meanings, and we need to underscore the specific definition that subtends our argumentation. Second, we live in a world today very much grounded in language, and often our understanding of terminology is firmly grounded in the personal. We are all familiar with René Descartes' 1637 phrase, cogito ergo sum. In the 20th century, Charles Sanders Peirce's semiotics at the beginning and Jacques Derrida's theory of deconstruction in the 1960s would have us now say, loquor ergo sum. I speak, therefore I am. That said, for history, I intend the chronological record of events, usually attempting, on the basis of critical examination of source materials, to explain events, as the dictionary tells us. Namely, a systematic study and documentation of the past, whose goal is to describe, examine, question, and analyze past events, and investigate their patterns of subsequent cause and effect. In turn, for culture, I intend the aggregation of behavior, that is, language, ideas, beliefs, customs, codes, institutions, tools, techniques, works of art, rituals, and ceremonies, among other things. Among many, two people have offered warnings about the past, that is, history. In 1905, George Santayana stated, "Progress, far from consisting in change, depends on retentiveness. When change is absolute, there remains no being to improve and no direction to set for possible improvement. And when experience is not retained, infancy is perpetual." And then he says, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," as we all know. We might add here that those who do not know their history are not only condemned to the past, but indeed they may create romanticizing narratives that counter the very facts of their own history. This creative phenomenon was underscored decades later by James Baldwin when he wrote, "People who imagine that history flatters them, as it does, indeed since they wrote it, are impaled on their history like a butterfly on a pin and become incapable of seeing or changing themselves or the world." Hence, memory, Santayana, and history, Baldwin, are intertwined and at times in a not so positive fashion. This reminds us of Pierre Nora's concept that today there are no longer any, and I quote, "real environments of memory." Rather, he goes on, only sites of memory. The first would be history, the second, memory as recollection. Memory, Nora writes, and I quote, "remains in permanent evolution, open to the dialectic of remembering and forgetting, unconscious to its successive deformation." He then continues, "Memory, as it is affective and magical, only accommodates those facts that suit us. It nourishes recollections that may be out of focus or telescopic, global or detached, particular or symbolic, responsive to each avenue of conveyance or phenomenal screen, to every censorship or projection. History, because it is an intellectual and secular production, calls for analysis and criticism. Memory is thus effective and magical and only accommodates those facts that suit us. History, in turn, is the problematic and incomplete reconstruction, as Nora continues. That is what is no longer. It is an intellectual and secular act that calls for analysis and criticism. More significant is that we are dealing with an uncoupling of history and memory, as well as the distortion of one and the other. Nora states the following, and I quote, "On the one hand, we find an integrated dictatorial memory, unself-consciousness, commanding, all-powerful, spontaneously actualizing, a memory without a past that ceaselessly reinvents tradition, taking the history of its ancestors to the undifferentiated time of heroes, origins, and truth. And on the other hand, our memory, nothing more in fact than sifted and sorted historical sites, traces." While Nora seems to distinguish between two types of memory above, I would contend that they are less distinguishable and more interreliant, indeed different facts of memory at large. Thus it is, and I quote again, accommodation of those facts that suit us, namely the sifted and sorted historical traces, a memory uncoupled from history, and that is a memory without a past, as we read above. That is, that lays the foundation for the creation of illogical pairings and romanticized narratives. This distinction between memory and history also calls into question how much we wish to remember history as it has unfolded, as opposed to remembering only those things that make us feel good. That is, Nora's the facts that suit us. And so we might ask, what are the consequences of such factual dilution? Such a question pushes us to heed the thoughts of an even earlier thinker than Peirce, Santayana, or Derrida. In his 1790 essay, Reflections on the Revolution in France, Edmund Burke wrote the following, and I quote, "People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors," end of quote. The late Felix Stefanile put it another way: there is no ontology without archaeology. Intentional or not, within the Italian American population, we have seen evidence of such historical equivocation. Now that normally would be for another setting. I go on in this paper, and I'm going to stop soon as far as what this text is. I go on to talk about a sort of therapeutic that involves, one, history, that is knowing it, two, acculturation versus assimilation. If someone decides to assimilate, then their sense of hyphenation stops. Well, they haven't reached a sense of state of hyphenation, stops there, and they are wherever they are, an American, an Argentinian, an Australian, et cetera, right? Then there's the idea of representation, knowing the difference between yesterday and today and being able to articulate it. Then there, of course, is the articulation of ethnicity. At this point, you should be able to talk about in some concerted and intelligent way about your ethnicity. Then you arrive at a notion of identity. And at that point, you sort of feel you are that hyphenated individual wherever you are. And then I talk about an interethnic collaboration and the idea of collaboration and education. That is, our interethnic collaboration is very important for us to become a part of that greater fabric of whatever the collective is in the country in which we live. Now, what are some of the issues that have come up in the United States? The title of my paper starts with, I think, "We Know What Italians Did." In 2017, the fan got sullied in the United States with regard to Christopher Columbus and the value that some people placed on Christopher Columbus and the denigration that others looked toward Columbus, right? So at a certain point, some people in places of, we might say, influence or impact, that is, the heads of certain organizations or some of the self-proclaimed leaders of the discourse of Italian Americans, started to now expound on what it means to be an Italian American, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the leaders actually said, and then wrote on Facebook, this was in the wake of a young Italian American supervisor in the city of San Francisco. They're called supervisors, members of the city council. Saw the writing on the wall and realized that at a certain point, Columbus Day was going to disappear. And so she thought the best thing to do would be to propose an alternative. And so she proposed the alternative of, let's call it Italian Heritage Day, let's call it Italian American Day, and whatever. And the president of a major organization wrote on Facebook, because then there was a whole conversation that went on. We know what Italians did for this country. What have indigenous people done? So when you arrive at a point in which the president of a major organization states something as inane as that and offensive as that, you really sort of, really recalls that sort of 1990s disco dance things that make you go, These are some of the issues that we've come across. There was another issue where someone wanted to talk about the essence of being Italian American. Hard work. Everybody works hard. Loyalty to family. Everybody, mostly everybody, is loyal in some way to their family. And this is the third. Our centuries-long devotion to our Catholic faith. Now, if you know anything about the population of Italy, the religious population of Italy, you know it's not 100%. It's not even 95%. It's possibly 80, if not 75, that is not Catholic, but Christian. So that includes then Protestants and so on and so forth. Also, what people don't know is that the first group of Italians, about 300 of them, who came to North America were Waldensians. That is part of a group of lapsed Catholics because they found the church in the 12th century to be too dogmatic and too violent. We're in the middle of the Crusades. So these are some of the things that we come across, those of us in the academy and indeed at the Calandra Institute in the United States when we're trying to engage in the town gown discussion, make the academy sort of visit the streets and have the streets visit the academy. I think we've made some progress. Fred and I and a few others have worked diligently in trying to talk to some of these people, but we still have a long way to go, and we're hopeful that at one point or another, some of those self-proclaimed leaders will realize what the indigenous people did. Thank you. At this point, we have about 20 minutes. I think the session is supposed to end at 11. I've got 10:40. So if there are any questions, somebody will come around with a microphone, I think. I'll call on people from up here. Yes.
Thank you, Lara, and I agree. Thank you for making this whole conference fabulous. Really a round of applause. And bravo, what a capstone presentation for the end of this beautiful, beautiful conference. So thank you very much. I'm a therapist, and I'm extremely involved and concerned about the next generation of Italians and how they identify with being Italian. And in every presentation that I've gone to in the last few days, the notion of nostalgia in one way or another has been very prominent. And Donna, thank you for bringing some of that up. I mean, the notion of trauma when people are displaced is not lost, for me anyway. And the notion of intergenerational trauma, the burden we carry generations down the line for the trauma of those people who are displaced. And so I'm wondering if any of you would speak to, I'm very involved right now in trying to bring young people, giving them accessibility to Italian music, contemporary music, because I think that a lot is going on in Italian contemporary music that speaks to the future of Italy and the future of the Italian identity. But I'm wondering if you'd speak to, you know, the intergenerational trauma that I heard in stories, and Fred, I heard in your story as well, and that we need to call it that sometimes in order to deal with it, because nostalgia is about loss, and loss needs to be dealt with in a way that you can move forward and not get stuck in. And I worry sometimes that we get stuck in nostalgia, and I worry that my son and his generation doesn't identify with that nostalgia. He needs to be Italian in a different way. And I'm doing what I can as a therapist to address that, but I'm wondering if you might want to speak to it.
I think it's a more general issue. I mean, certainly in the United States, there is an increasing concern about mental health, mental well-being, right? I mean, that's the issue, right? Well-being rather than just continually focusing on staying in that negative state. However, this has been a great challenge because many ethnic communities, including Italian Americans, don't seek the kind of intervention they need, which brings us to your point. There are other types of untraditional or non-traditional therapies, whether it's music therapy, art therapy, or other places where someone can experience or express that sense of, I'm going to call it disconnection. Yes, there are feelings with it. And we know, by the way, there's increasing evidence that trauma is carried from generation to generation, which is, there's a lot of work done in the Jewish community about this. So I think a big step is having our children understand from the beginning that it's not a negative thing to seek mental health assistance. But of course, in the United States, this is still seen as a weakness, right? You can't solve your own problems. I mean, think of all the American ideas, right? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Individuality, the whole, John Wayne mentality that still persists in the growing manosphere, right? So getting individuals to seek help is where it starts, and that, of course, starts from the very beginning, that it's okay to ask for help, right? Which goes against what immigrants often feel, that you have to persist and proceed on your own, and seeking help goes against that.
But I also think that I was the first in my family to go through therapy. And when I was going through it, my mother found out. I didn't tell her. And somebody told her. And she said, I want to have a talk with you, which is always a problematic. Because she prefers to listen than talk. But when she talks, nobody else can get a word in. But she said, I think it's really good that you're going to get help. You're getting divorced. You should have never married that blonde anyway, But, so she went through it. She says, but just don't tell him anything about the family. And I was going through therapy at the same time that Tony Soprano was on TV. And so to me, the way that intergenerational trauma is maintained is through silence and lies. When the foundation of your world is built on lies, and you can live very well until it cracks and you fall through. And then you're mired in these lies that you have to begin to make sense of. And the lying was all about protection. It wasn't about deception. They were trying to deceive us into thinking life was better than what it was, but it really was about protecting us from things they didn't think we should know.
Thank you. The lies are a way of coping sometimes. And imagine when I told my parents I wanted to be a therapist. But I just want to add that I'm not just advocating therapy. There are many ways, and identity is foundational to wellness. It's foundational, and social connection is foundational to identity. And so it's not just going to see a therapist. It's really dealing with this crisis that we find our youth in right now, that are disconnected and disenfranchised. And we as an Italian community have that other layer of, how do they identify as being Italian? And therapy is one way, but there's so many other ways.
But you could take them and drop them in Italy and leave them there. I did that with both of my children, who both speak fluent Italian, and now my grandchildren. I don't force them. I don't say this is what you need to do. I just say come with me. And one of the things my grandson said is when we got to Castellana, my hometown, he says, no, why can't we always eat like this? So they're all going to find their own way in. I found my way in. I went against, my uncle said, there's no milk in Italy. They don't have they don't have bathrooms in the homes. Everything is outside. Why? Because they had the story that my grandfather may have told them about it, which he didn't tell me. And so the whole idea of you have to let people find their own ways. And this is what Italian-American organizations don't do. They say, this is what you need to do to be Italian. You need to come to these meetings. You need to come and celebrate this event and these feasts and so on. Come and worship at the altar of Columbus, and then you will be a real Italian.
This is a responsibility, really, of the Italian Americans. At least, I don't know what goes on in the other countries, but for Italians in America, this is a responsibility, in my opinion, the Italian American organizations. We have 5 very powerful, very well-heeled organizations that try to set the discourse. But many, not all, but many of them can't set the discourse because they haven't read the books to give them the information to set the discourse. And so we find ourselves in at heads, with a lot of them. Fred and I, a number about, I don't know, before COVID, we tried to do a quote unquote town hall, and we got some funding to do it, and they came, and some of the leaders, self-proclaimed, in some cases came. And this is right around, this is about 2018, so it was a year after the whole Columbus brouhaha in New York, which then spread nationally. One person actually said, someone who does not speak Italian, someone who clearly has not read basic books of Italian American history, said, if you don't support Columbus, you are a traitor to your heritage. Those are the terms that are used. These sort of semi-violent terms are used. So, we have a choice in the United States to either fold back into the academy. It's very comfortable to be at the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute and not have to deal with any of this. We can do our own thing. We're state funded. We don't have to worry about going out and fundraise, whatever. We can do our own thing. But we feel, all of us, Donna's part of it, Joseph Shore, we feel a certain obligation, and then we have other staff members. We have, by the way, a 33-year-old doing a doctorate in Italian American intellectual history. So there's hope out there. We have a number, we've met and collaborated with a number of under 50-year-olds within the academy who are doing Italian American history, Italian American. So there is hope out there. There is hope. There's also, however, there's a group in the United States called Growing Up Italian. They have about 350 or 400,000 followers on TikTok, on Instagram, etc. And they're very much, I would like to say that they're very much in an ironic articulation, but I don't believe they're ironic, because they venture too much into the sort of sexist and misogynist. So they can't be ironic. And I can explain that later when we chat. But they have a line of clothing, and they have a line of clothing called Vaffa clothing. And so you can buy a t-shirt that says Vaffanculo, and you could buy soccer shirts that say Vaffanculo, and you could buy a sweatshirt, and so on and so forth. And they think that's cool, So it's a lack of education on the one hand. Unfortunately, those to whom they look are people who engage, you call it nostalgia or call it the victimization, the woe are us. People who are worth $15, $20 million are complaining about being discriminated against. But you can't arrive at that point if you're really suffering discrimination, right? And so there's that as well, including Linda knows about all this stuff.
If I can briefly join the discussion, even though I'm not American, I'm fully fledged Italian. I appreciate the efforts made by the Calandra Institute and your sense of obligation. And I think this is the real issue. I don't think that we have to charge the Italian American establishment, the NIAF and other organizations. The responsibility is primarily with Italian American intellectuals who are completely secluded from the Italian American community. And so they cannot spread the meaning of Italianness and leave the field to people who say, if you don't love Christopher Columbus, you're not Italian.
So, and that's a good point, because now what I've inferred from what you just said, there is not one program at the doctoral level in Italian American Studies in the United States. You can do some graduate work, not much, but some at NYU, because they have the Tito Assegno visiting scholar who comes every other year. And you can also do Italian American Studies within a PhD program at Florida Atlantic University, where Ilaria Serra and Emanuele Petener work. Much of the resistance and then when Fred came to Queens College, we put up some courses at the MA level in Italian American Studies. But there's no structural program for Italian American Studies. And the resistance, oddly, and not oddly, if you know the Italian literary establishment, the resistance, a lot of it comes from Italian studies programs that offer a PhD.
And you should also all know, if you don't know by now, that we have been producing the Italian Diaspora Studies Summer Seminar for the last 9 years. Primarily it began as a way, because I wanted to do a NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities seminar, summer seminar. Three proposals were rejected and by the national government. And so we decided we were going to create our own program. And we raised the money every year. It takes a lot of money. But if you know young scholars who want to go and study the Italian diaspora, not Italian American studies, not Italian Australian studies, but the Italian diaspora. I teach a course in Italian diaspora literature. Anthony teaches Italian diaspora film, et cetera, et cetera. Go to the Calandra website and send those students there. Why? Because we give 50% fellowships. You know, someday I would like to get to the point where we can just bring people for free. But that's not going to happen. But I also believe that you got to pay a little, you got to put a little bit of money in the game if you're going to make it interesting. And so our goal is to create outside of the institutions what the institutions have not allowed us to create, and that is a future of thinkers of Italian and diaspora and culture. So if you know graduate students, professors who want to develop more curriculum, send them to us.
And let me just add that 5 of the fellows who were in those programs through those 9 years presented at this conference.
And the majority actually of the fellows over the years have been professors, college professors coming from as far as China. Clorinda, you have your hand up?
I would like to ask a question. I've been waiting for a while. Thank you very much.
Of the what?
I want to thank you for calling a spade when it comes to representation, because what happens in the US happens in Canada as well. I can only speak for Quebec and Montreal, where I come from. So I just want to illustrate a point in terms of the Columbus situation. I was part of the National Italian American Bar Association. I was on the board because they needed, we were 2 Canadians on the board. And when that issue came up, I was the dissenting voice. And this was before it got blown out of proportion in a sense. I was ousted from the board. I was also the dissenting voice for the magazine We Italians. The director cut all communication with me because I was opposing.
We're in the same club.
So what I proposed was, if Columbus is an issue, why can't you have a statue to give homage to the Italians that were lynched in New Orleans? And now they took that as a basis to justify why Columbus Day came to being, when in the past they never made reference to that.
No.
So I asked, can you please, instead of putting Christopher Columbus, if that's an issue, make a statue, commission a statue to render homage to the Italians who were lynched, the Sicilians who were lynched in New Orleans.
So Margherita, here's the deal. Up until, like, many Italian Americans had no idea of the lynching until the mayor made the apology in 2019, and then it went nationwide. And we heard so many of these self-proclaimed leaders or self-proclaimed spokespeople say, oh, wow, I never knew. Oh, really? I didn't know that, whatever. And so on and so forth, you know. Now, so you mentioned We the Italians. So We the Italians is really part of what I call a carpetbagger, right? You know, the American Civil War, after the American Civil War, there were carpetbaggers and scalawags. The carpetbaggers were those from the North, and they were called carpetbaggers because their suitcases were made out of the material that carpets were made of. So they were called carpetbaggers. And then there were the scalawags. The scalawags instead were those who were in the South. They were mostly Republicans in the South, and they wanted to, quote unquote, help Reconstruction, but basically they were doing it because they wanted to profit from it. And there's no dialogue with some of these. There's no dialogue with carpetbaggers, and there's no dialogue with scalawags.
Thank you for a great panel. I have a question for Donna, but probably maybe for a little bit for everybody. I mean, is some trauma good? One of the things, the problems that I have, so I have, you know, I have 3 children. My husband's Italian. In order for them to understand something of my life, so I absorbed the trauma of my parents, but I don't think I have transmitted that to them. And there is some of that trauma that is related to identity. And if you don't feel that, I'm sometimes afraid that they're not going to understand the Italian American part of their heritage because they don't have any experience of that trauma.
It's an interesting point. The point we're not adding in, and I don't want to get psychological because that's not the point of this conference, but we also have to remember that there are independent characterological features that hear the trauma, and that some people have better resilience than others. So it's the individuals who have resilience who are going to handle the trauma in a more constructive way, as opposed to individuals who lack that or who tend toward more depressive features or other kind of features who will then mishandle it. So it's why the education piece is so important, because it's, yes, we as parents, caregivers, people who are being generative, we can tell the stories, but to hear it in a context where they get to read, they get to hear other opinions, they get to then discuss it in a rational way is extremely important, rather than simply internalizing the trauma as if it's a burden or a guilt that they have to carry. So I think it is an important point that, you know, as Fred said, you know, you didn't talk about the negatives, you know, you didn't hear about the bad elements of the past. I mean, people don't know Clorinda's story. She did not discover her father's war diary until after he died, right? So it was never spoken about, what he experienced, the negative things that had happened to him. Imagine how much more you would have appreciated it if you could have discussed it with him. Right? So the fact that we do keep these secrets, we don't really tell the fullness of the story to other people, makes it harder for the person hearing it. So again, it has to do with education, disclosure, discussion, all the things we've been talking about.
But I think they also developed their own sense of Italy that doesn't depend on that. I mean, I wrote a book called Leaving Little Italy, and the whole idea was that my grandparents came to the United States and they told me stories of Italy. I tell my children stories of a little Italy that doesn't exist anymore. What stories do my children tell and my grandchildren? Now they tell the stories, oh, I went to Italy. This is what they bring back. And it becomes different. But I don't think necessarily because you don't directly pass that trauma on, it gets passed on. You still pass something on. There's something going on. I mean, you know, I thought I studied psychology in college. I'm not going to screw up my children. Screw them up anyway, somehow. You know? So there's some kind of unprocessed trauma that passes to that generation. And I think just to be aware of it is enough. Figuring out what it is each individual person's responsibility.
Just a closure on Fred's statement, and I'm going to curse. Many years ago, there was an issue of the magazine Granta devoted to family dynamics. And the cover of Granta on the newsstand said, "The family, they fuck you up."
Then they put a white tag over the fuck in the bookstore, in the stores.
Thank you. Just a quick comment, and then I have a question for Anthony. I wanted to just agree, in writing a novel, I had to dissect what that trauma was. The trauma was passed down even when it wasn't about, it was very present. And then trying to figure out where it came from and what it looked like and what was happening within those people was an exploration of that. But I think that the trauma is coming, whether you talk about it's in every move you make, it's in the breath that you breathe. So the more you explore it and identify it and then perhaps heal it, be made whole, the better it is. But this is for Anthony. I'm wondering about your thoughts of where garden variety American anti-intellectualism dovetails into what these groups are and what their understanding is and their distrust of other ways of thinking about the history might be.
I just think it's a question of intellectual lethargy. I just think they're lazy. I think that they're that's, I do know other ways to say it. That is, they believe that they know, but they don't know. Because, they had a nonna or a nonna. I published an article called Beyond Pizza Nonna. And the article had nothing to do with pizza, Beyond Pizza Nonna. I got flack for that saying Beyond Pizza Nonna from people who are not in the know. They had absolutely no idea, right, that we had to go beyond that. I really think it's a question of them, one, not knowing, two, not wanting to hear that they should read 2, 3, or 4 books. There are some really they're out of print, but they're really good books on a sort of general Italian American, let's say, history of the first half of the 20th century. Michael Musmano was a lawyer who wrote 10 or 12 books on law, but then at the end of he decides to write a book on Italians in America. It's really good. It's political science, Alexandra De Conde, who wrote also Bittersweet, a book on sort of a general history, right? And those are really good books. They're out of print, unfortunately, but they're really good books. But those are books they can pick up in the library, in their local libraries, whether they live in Westchester County, whether they live wherever they live, Cleveland, wherever they may live. You can find those books in the library. So I think also, and we talk about this all the time, I think also it's a question of them being intimidated by us who have doctorates and so on and so forth. And that's the issue, because when you push them on certain things, and you have to do it gingerly, when you push them on certain things, they seem to prick up their ears. Oh, really? Whatever. But you can't attack them. And so, we feel that we should continue to do, now we've had some success, I would say, in some ways, but it's an uphill battle.
The intellectual infrastructure has to be there. It wasn't there when I was going to school. I learned about Columbus and Capone. That was it, the 2 seeds of Italian American culture. One discovered America, the other one figured out how to rip it off. So when there is no intellectual leadership, there was never a teacher in my school that said, hey, you should study. I had an African-American professor at University of Wisconsin. He goes, hey, man, white people got roots too. And that changed me immediately. And so if there's no representation of you in the school, then you don't value. This is why Italian-American leaders don't value their own culture, because it wasn't valued in their education. It wasn't necessary, and most of the times the way to defend being Italian-American when I was growing up was in the streets fighting.
So I go back to the idea of Italian American or Italian diaspora studies program having to be at the university, in the university level, because that's when we form the future professors of Italian American or Italian diaspora studies. But it's a problem in Italy as well. It's a problem in Italy as well. With all the minute categories that Anvur has for their fascia and fascia whatever, and so on and so forth, nowhere will you find Italian American studies already in Italy is a Cinderella. Nowhere will you find Italian American studies, and nowhere beyond sociology can the word diaspora be used? Because it's not part of the category, the mentality of whoever is behind Anvur, depending on who's in government. And so, but it's not, it's really, until we get those programs in the universities, people will be saying, people after us will be saying the same thing, you know, and that's where we are. And so our hope is that we can convince the well-heeled, though not the well-informed, and we can convince them that it's good to do whatever. The Diaspora, the Italian Diaspora Studies program costs us about between $80,000 and $85,000 each summer. Now, we lucked out. We found one organization that committed 30 for 5 years and a couple that committed 15 for 5 years. And that already put us at a, sign of relief for the last 5 years. We have 1 year relief now. We have to start fundraising it. But it's really a question of getting the programs in the universities. And we have to fight for it. And in the past, there has been too much what I call hypercorrection. And that is Italian professors of Italian, or those who wanted to do Italian American studies, wouldn't fight for it because they didn't want to be known as overbearing or whatever. When I became the graduate director at Purdue University in the world languages, we changed a little bit. When they brought me into Completed at Purdue, we changed a little bit. There were like 4 students from Purdue Completed American Studies who are out there teaching now because we allowed them to do that. We had a director who was a classicist, who was multilingual, and he was fluent in Italian, so he did it. The same thing at Florida Atlantic University. When I went there, we did the same thing. We just pushed forward. And, people say, well, don't you think they're going to call you mafia or whatever? No, because the French do it and the Spanish do it. Why can't we do it? And we did. We did. So that's the other thing. We, professors of Italian, don't want to be involved in administration. But that's where the decisions are being made. If you're not in the room with the deans, with the chairs and with the deans, then you have no game, no play in the game. And that's what we have to do. In 2004, there were only 3 professors of Italian in the United States who were chairs of multilingual departments. And it was Mark Pietronunga at Florida State, Paolo Giordano at the University of Central Florida, and me at Florida Atlantic University. And that was it. Now, it's true, Italian professors will often get outnumbered by the French and the German and the Spanish, right? But it's also true that they can become chairs. And how often do we hear, oh my God, oh, I don't want to get involved in administration. Well, then you can't bitch and moan if you don't get involved in administration. And how many profs have I come across, oh, I don't want to get involved, no, not me, and then I'm looking and say, well, where's the intellectual activity then you say you're doing? Where are the books? Where are the articles? Where are the books? Then what are you doing if you're not getting involved? And this is really a basic challenge. It's a basic challenge. Yeah, we've gone 10 minutes over. Thank you all. We'll be back here at 11:30.